Welcome, and thanks for joining us. My guest today is Amanda Warfield, the Vice President of Program Integrity at Optum Serve. Amanda, great to be speaking with you again.
Thanks, you too. Good to see you.
Good to see you. To dive into all things generative AI, this is, of course, a fast-moving area of technology. Things are changing by the day. But just to level set here, this is something that the federal government has been taking a closer look at, been more serious about this. So what is, from your perspective, the value add, the value proposition of exploring this technology and implementing it in the federal government space?
Yeah, for sure. I think generative AI has really created a huge shift in the world of AI. We've seen AI for years, and I think over the last several months, in the last year or so, we've really seen an explosion in generative AI. And I think, the federal government has really been trying to apply the right set of guidelines around it and figure out where it is the most valuable, where it can create the most efficiencies. And I think, at the top level, it's really around introducing automation to manual processes across, any number of areas. So there's an opportunity to really take a look at things that typically require, labor-intensive steps, manual review of documents, things like that can really be streamlined, improving things like end user support, and ultimately for federal agencies, no matter what the program is, really applying it in a way that can help improve the consumer experience. Whoever the constituent is for a given agency, how can that be applied to help streamline things, make their lives easier when they're applying for program benefits or things like that really add value and are meaningful to agencies' missions.
Yeah. And I guess the flip side of that is if the automation is tackling those manual rote tasks, that frees up the federal workforce to do the higher order things that, they're paid to do and have more time to do those things.
Exactly. It's about, being efficient, saving time and money, and then being able to really prioritize the workload that gives you the most value, the most ROI.
All right. Well, obviously, again, this is something that has a lot of promise for agencies, but once the rubber hits the road here, what are some of those common challenges agencies face with implementing this technology?
Yeah, I think there's been a lot of challenges or inhibitors to adoption of generative AI. It can create challenges in ensuring that the right processes are in place to make sure that the AI and the machine learning models that go into using generative AI, are not biased, that the right context, like a specific agency's context and subject matter expertise, is applied to those models. You can't just go out and take, ChatGPT and apply it to magically work for, HHS mission or in Medicare processes or things like that. You have to really take an approach that factors in, agency-specific data, agency-specific expertise and context, so that the structure that you have set up, the models that you select, are trained in a way that are effective. So you want to make sure that those types of things are really accounted for up front. And you also need to make sure that from like an operations perspective, a lot of generative AI processes involve integrating documents or data from all over. It could be, manuals or regulations or documentation produced publicly or within, the boundaries of a given agency's area to access data. And there has to be a way to ensure that data is always accurate, it's always current, it's the latest, version that you're accessing. So that when you actually apply it into your business processes, you're getting the right answers and the right accuracy. And I think the third challenge is really around security, making sure that the right security measures are put in place. There's a lot of concerns from that security and privacy perspective, and making sure that it's applied in the right manner and compliant with all the federal security guidelines that exist. So I think those are some of the things that make it difficult and challenging to figure out how to adopt generative AI.
Yeah, a couple things to dive into there. I'm glad you brought up the data piece of things, because I think for a lot of these AI algorithms, they are very hungry for a lot of data, a lot of good structured data to train up, to understand kind of the purpose they're being built to serve. In terms of those data challenges, those data bottlenecks, what can agencies do to make sure that they have the right data sets to train up those AI algorithms?
Yeah, I think it's about consulting with the right set of experts up front before agencies make a decision on what the right solution is that they want to use to deploy generative AI. making sure that the processes are in place so that data is available and accessible, and ensuring that the right, best practices for selecting what really powers generative AI, which is something known as large language models, that are intended to, they do kind of the big power behind the generative AI. They do all that computation and analyzing all of those documents and data sets. And having a way to select the right large language model or LLM for the right use case is really important. It's not like a one-size-fits-all approach. So I think it's really important to make sure agencies are consulting with the right experts up front to have that selection criteria defined, to make sure those decisions are made in a way that's really effective.
Mm-hmm. And I think another key takeaway from what you've already said is that, again, generative AI is not kind of this thing you magically sprinkle over your problems and they go away. That is, it's a valuable tool, but there's things you got to do, kind of laying the groundwork, so to speak, before that happens. And I think back to how most things in government come down to people, process, and technology.
Mm-hmm.
We've been talking about the tech piece of things and a little bit about the people side of things, but can you tell me a little bit more about the processes that kind of need to be done before all of this really gels and comes together?
Yeah, of course. I think, with any kind of IT or technical solution, there has to be, factors in place and decisions that are made to make sure the right process to implement and to deploy, a framework is set up. So I mentioned things like making sure documentation and data is accurate and timely and refreshed. Setting up best practices for how can you automatically detect when perhaps a document is updated and it needs to be loaded into your generative AI framework or ingested into your model. Making sure that there's monitoring in place, DevSecOps best practices that are there, that are listening for those types of changes and factoring them in, and doing it in a way that again is also secure. And I think another thing that's really critical from a process perspective is that human in the loop step. Is really something that across all areas of AI, and certainly including generative AI, where your AI, and whether you have an assistant in place and you can ask a natural language question, you still need to make sure there's a human in the loop and you're not just taking whatever the response is by itself and using that for decision making. So that human in the loop oversight is really important. Monitoring the results of your generative AI, answers, making sure they're continuing to stay accurate, the training or retraining of the models that needs to happen to stay current and refreshed. All those process things have to be built into your overall framework.
Yeah, and moving on over to the security side of things, you were mentioning about making sure that these algorithms are free of bias, that they are dependable, all these things that really are critical to fielding any kind of generative AI. How can agencies ensure that any Gen AI that they're using aligns with kind of responsible AI practices and principles?
Yeah, I think it's really important to, again, make sure that the security experts are there up front whenever the decision is made to select the generative AI tool or solution, that the security experts are right there to make sure, this is checking the boxes. And then just that design, thinking that involves security first and the zero trust type of mindset, where you're thinking about, how the data is going to come into your federal enclave. How are you going to ensure that the data never leaves your security boundary? What checks and balances do you have that you can, apply up front and make sure those are part of, your selection criteria, that decisions are being made to factor those in. So I think those types of things are really important from a security perspective.
Yeah, and obviously we've kind of broken down some of the buckets in which generative AI might be deployed. That there's healthcare applications, there's watchdog applications. If you're an IG, there's several flavors of use cases here. But I imagine there's probably some common things as far as best housekeeping for Gen AI. What are some of those best practices that federal agencies, generally speaking, should keep in mind when it comes to applying these algorithms and putting them into their day-to-day business practices?
Yeah, I think one thing there is really defining as sort of specifically as possible the use case. What are you trying to get out of generative AI? How are you intending to use it? What steps in your business process are you hoping to improve or automate or make more efficient? And I think making sure that those are defined up front is really critical, because that's an indicator of which direction you want to go in terms of the right tool. And it's also something that defines the right model. Like I mentioned about how these large language models are not a one-size-fits-all, depending on the scope of what you're trying to cover. One particular model may be better than another. And there's a lot of models available in the open source world that can be used and tested and applied. And I think making sure that those definitions and you know how to test it, right? You know how to make sure you're using the right questions that are designed for your business case up front that are really going to help you with that.
Yeah, and it just kind of maybe would put a coda to that idea of just, a lot of this is, again, fast moving. This is a lot of change management for the workforce. How can agencies really kind of help communicate that piece to their employees, that this is something that's going to help them augment their work, not kind of replace them, or something that's a little more anxiety inducing?
Yeah, and I think it's the way it's kind of messaged. I mentioned things like the human in the loop oversight. There's always going to be a person that's there along the way, and generative AI is just there to kind of supplement and make those tasks that most people probably don't like doing, those busy work and those things where it's either data entry or a lot of, manual review of large documents, things that take you a lot of time, that if you had a way to streamline that, to automatically have a tool that's going to identify like the right section of a 1,000-page document for you, I think we all would see there being value in that. And then, as we were saying earlier, for employees, it's kind of the same thing. Like they can then spend their time, doing more of, what their specialized skill is. So it can really take away that burden, that administrative burden in a lot of areas, and be able to get to, your end goal faster.
All right. Well, Amanda, all great stuff. There's plenty more to get into, but we'll get to that after the break. Again, my guest today is Amanda Warfield, the Vice President of Program Integrity at Optum Serve. I'm reporter Jory Heckman on the discussion, the do's and don'ts of generative AI for program integrity, sponsored by Optum Serve on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the discussion, the do's and don'ts of GenAI for program integrity, sponsored by Optum Serve on Federal News Network. My guest today is Amanda Warfield, the Vice President of Program Integrity at Optum Serve. I'm Federal News Network reporter Jory Heckman. Amanda, picking up where we left off, we were kind of talking generally about what federal agencies can do when it comes to generative AI. Let's zoom in on one particular use case here, generative AI to flag and prevent fraud, waste, and abuse in the federal government. Obviously, what we've seen with recent years is that IGs and other watchdogs are just inundated with spending data, and it's a tougher job than it's ever been, but they do have these new tools available. So given that kind of cat and mouse game, right, staying one step ahead of the criminals and the fraudsters out there, what can those IG shops do?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a couple of, steps in the overall fraud, waste, and abuse process where, AI is involved in a general sense. Upfront in using, analytics and predictions to identify fraud and flag, claims and providers and in like healthcare space. AI is involved there. And some of the downstream places where I think generative AI specifically has more application is supporting that step after the fraud is identified, and the investigations, the development of the cases to actually prosecute and take down either providers across Medicare or healthcare or across VA programs, things like that, where generative AI can really be a huge time saver. If you listen to anything that a lot of the IGs are speaking to, and some of their challenges just holistically, is they have more cases than they can work, right? They have finite resources. They don't have agents to work and prosecute every case that comes their way. They get referrals and tips from all over the place. So imagine being able to apply generative AI to streamline what today is very manual. Looking in the federal healthcare area specifically, a lot of what's involved from an IG perspective in building a case is analyzing data. Looking, if we're talking about like a provider, for example, in healthcare, it's looking at, eons of claims data and comparing that to policy documentation and federal regulations and guidelines to essentially prove that what the provider did or what they billed, violated policy, and how they prove that that's intentional. So it involves a lot of manual research, of combing through data, of combing through these large documents, and to empower agents with a tool that can easily condense down massive amounts of PDF files and documents and all sorts of data into a human-like Q&A format that they could say, tell me if Medicare covers XYZ, orthotics or whatever type of case they're prosecuting, and they would be able to quickly pull up that section of whatever the Medicare policy or Medicaid policy or local coverage determinations, things like that can really be time consuming, and it can provide an easy to use way for anybody who has healthcare experience or doesn't to be able to interpret those big documents. So I would call that like a policy assistant type of a use case where from a program integrity and fraud, waste, and abuse point of view, it's a really powerful enabler to really tackle fraud. And I think the other area is getting into that case-specific support and looking at data. And a lot of folks who support fraud, waste, and abuse on the downstream side and looking at cases for potential prosecution or other action. Not all of them are, technical individuals who know how to query data or write SQL queries or a program, but they still have a need to access data, to aggregate data, to look at trends over time, and using generative AI in a way that allows a regular person like me, to just go in and say, hey, can you tell me, how many claims over the last year have been paid using this type of a procedure code? And then have that data automatically aggregated for you, or have the query written for you so that you can just go drop it in somewhere, or even produce charts and visualizations for you that show you that data in a meaningful way that really gives you the insights right off the bat. Those are huge time savers. For individuals who typically would have to refer that to someone else, wait days or weeks to get the data back, it can really speed up that process. And case proceedings and things can take a long time anyway before you even get to that point. So that can really be a huge time saver and a cost saver, being able to take action sooner. And then I think the third area that I would mention is as a training aid. As different federal offices like the IGs or like different program integrity offices within agencies themselves are ramping up new staff, or they may have turnover, or they're just hiring. It can be a big learning curve for individuals to get up to speed with what the different processes are. So being able to ingest like user guides or work instructions or standard operating procedures, things like that, into a generative AI framework that is run against your large language models, instead of you having to sit in a 6-hour-long training and try to remember where the section was that was relevant to you. You can then use your generative AI assistant to say, hey, remind me what our SOP is for whatever the process is, and be able to pull up that section really quickly, or just have it summarized for you in a nice, easy to read response. So those are like really tangible applications that I think can be really effective in creating efficiencies and just helping to get things done faster.
Yeah, I think that's really important to break down every step of the process there, because I think a lot of the watchdog offices that we've spoken to, they really do describe their work as finding a needle in a haystack, and there's more haystack now than there's ever been, but being able to kind of point those human employees in the right direction faster seems to really speed up that whole process.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Moving along here, what are some key elements of a generative AI framework to support kind of this growing universe of guidances and principles and rules that agencies need to follow when fielding AI?
Yeah, I think it's about, defining the process and how you operationalize generative AI. We talked about, messaging this to employees. We talked about involving the right experts up front. And then I think when it's rolled out within an agency, like for example, if it was rolled out within like an IG office, for example, making sure that there's parameters and guidelines around what it's used for, as a way to augment and streamline your process, but not to replace what your own, assessment is, or what your evaluation is, or what your summary is, I think is really important to be successful. and making sure that it's easy to use, it's accessible to your staff, and it performs quickly, right? You want to make sure it's been kind of battle tested and the right IT pieces have been put in place so that it's fast. It's giving you those responses quickly, and so that helps increase your adoption as well. So those things make it really effective for agencies when they go to deploy.
Yeah, and as far as those kind of getting started steps, everything we've been talking about is about speed, right? Speed of this technology, the speed at which this marketplace has grown. I think there is a dizzying number of choices of products that agencies have to look at when it comes to when they want to field generative AI. So how can agencies kind of partner with industry, understand what their needs and requirements are, and ultimately get the product or the service that fits their needs in the most precise way?
Yeah, I think this is a great area where industry and government can really come together to define the right types of solutions that are really effective to augmenting and creating efficiencies in federal processes. And I think when it comes to that partnership, allowing the opportunity for that type of market research to happen, where folks like Optum Serve on the private side can really demonstrate examples, do deep dives into what have you done, how have you deployed generative AI, and literally show me how has it been successful. What have you learned from it? How are you addressing some of the challenges we spoke about earlier around security, around protecting the data, around responsible AI, and just be able to assess them and really have that selection criteria defined up front. And I think, again, it's another area where finding industry experts that understand your use case is critical. Because there's n number of tools out there that you could go either purchase or pull out of the open source space and try to apply. But again, if it's not defined and tailored for that type of use case, it's only going to get you so far. So I think partnering with industry to really understand those use cases and working with partners who have experience in those specific areas, like for program integrity and fraud, waste, and abuse, and making sure that that's factored into that solution and you can see it in a tangible way is really a great way to partner.
Yeah, and I think it's important to remind folks that the stuff we're talking about here is not hypothetical. It's not right around the corner. It's here. It's things you can get your hands dirty with, and it's something that is available, at all levels, really. So, with that in mind, what tools or what solutions are out there in the market for federal agencies to explore if they're curious about what generative AI can do for them?
Yeah, there's a lot of open source generative AI tools out there. I think there's probably not very many people who haven't heard of ChatGPT. So that's been around for a little while now, and we probably all used it in some way, shape, or form and tested that out just to get a sense of what generative AI is capable of doing. And all of the major cloud service providers like the AWS and the Azures of the world and Google Cloud, they all have their own form of large language models that are available in open source form. So you can actually access those through public ways and be able to actually test them yourselves. And most, all agencies are in one of those clouds at this point. So being able to access those through your federal enclave is also possible, just to test it out, see how it applies to your use case and get an idea of what you want and what you think it can do, where it can bring value to your business process before you go and meet with industry partners and to better understand how they could work with you to deploy a tailored solution. I think is a great way to just get a feeler for where the value is for you and your agency.
All right. Well, Amanda, I think we covered a ton of ground, but I think we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks again to today's guest, Amanda Warfield, the Vice President of Program Integrity at Optum Serve. I'm reporter Jory Heckman, and you're listening to Federal News Network. For more on this discussion, visit federalnewsnetwork.com and search Optum Serve.